My name is Elizabeth Clark, and I'm 57 years old. I never thought that at my age, life could change so dramatically. But that's exactly what happened on an ordinary spring day when my 20-year-old granddaughter, Emily, brought me a little box with a DNA test and practically begged me to try it. I was living a quiet, peaceful life in Montpelier, Vermont. My house was small but cozy, exactly what I wanted after 40 years of teaching elementary school. Morning walks through my garden, where I grew roses and lavender, reading historical novels by the fireplace, knitting for the local shelter. All of this made up my familiar world. The walls were covered with children's drawings given to me by students over the years, photos of my daughter Susan and granddaughter Emily. On the mantel stood a single photograph of a man, my late husband, Robert, with whom I'd shared 35 happy years. He'd passed away 5 years ago, and I still talked to his photograph every morning, telling him about my plans for the day. Emily, studying anthropology in Boston, was obsessed with the idea of understanding human roots. She burst into my house with her usual enthusiasm and that characteristic sparkle in her green eyes, insisting that we knew so little about our family, especially about Grandpa, who had died when I was 7 years old. Memories of that day always caused me pain. Even after 50 years, I remembered how Mom sat in the kitchen of our little house in Rutland, crying and saying that Daddy would never come home again. It was 1975. A heart attack. That's all they explained to me then. I remembered screaming, demanding to see Daddy, how Mom rocked me in her arms, repeating that he was gone. Emily pulled a bright box labeled Ancestry DNA from her bag and convinced me that this would be a real adventure, that we'd finally learn who we really are. I looked at the box with distrust. This whole scientific approach to family history seemed cold and impersonal to me. What if we learned something we'd rather not know? But something in my granddaughter's enthusiasm touched me. I agreed, and we sent my saliva to the lab. If I had known what kind of adventure awaited me, I would never have agreed to that test. The shock that turned my life upside down. 6 weeks later, I had almost forgotten about the test. I was preparing for a meeting with old colleagues, making my famous apple pie from my mother's recipe, when Emily called. Her voice sounded strange, as if she was shocked by something. The results had come in, and there was a close match. A very close match. A man named James Rivers from Florida. The system showed that he could be my father. I felt the world tilt. The words didn't register. This was impossible. My father had died in 1975, when he was 32 years old, but Emily had checked several times. The match was 50%. This couldn't be a mistake. James Rivers, 82 years old, lives in Fort Lauderdale. Memories flooded back. Father lifting me up and spinning me around the living room while Mom laughed. His big warm hands that braided my hair before school. The smell of his cologne when he read me bedtime stories. His voice humming a lullaby about a little bird that flew far, far away. And then, that terrible day when it all ended, I stared at the photograph of an elderly man with gray hair and familiar blue eyes. Eyes. I remembered those eyes. They looked at me from a photograph but sat on the dresser in Mom's bedroom until her death. My heart was beating so hard I was afraid it would stop. Emily came over within an hour, and together we wrote a message through the DNA testing platform. I introduced myself as Elizabeth Clark, maiden name Stone, explained that my father, William Stone, had supposedly died in 1975 when I was 7 years old, and asked him to contact me if it was him. I spent the rest of the day in emotional chaos, from hope to fear, from anger to despair. I canceled my meeting with colleagues, unable to pretend everything was fine. I couldn't sleep all night, going through fragments of childhood memories and trying to understand how such a thing could happen. The answer came the very next day. I was sitting in my garden, trying to distract myself by watering flowers when the phone rang. The voice was hoarse, elderly, but something about it seemed incredibly familiar. The man introduced himself as James Rivers and said he'd received my message. I felt my knees give way and slowly sank into the chair next to the phone, pressing the receiver to my ear so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I asked if he was my father, there was a long pause. Then a choked, pain-filled sigh. He called me Ellie. Only my father had ever called me that name. No one else had ever used that nickname. He said he'd missed my voice every single day of those damn 50 years. Tears poured from my eyes, and I couldn't stop them. I screamed into the phone, asking how this could have happened, why Mom said he died of a heart attack. He explained that's what they'd agreed on, that it was better for me. I sobbed, telling him that every year on his birthday, Mom took me to the cemetery, and I brought flowers to an empty grave, talked to a stone, thinking I was talking to him. His voice trembled when he learned this. He said he couldn't explain everything over the phone, that it was too complicated, and asked if I could come visit. He didn't have much time left. Pancreatic cancer, doctors said a few months, maybe less. I closed my eyes. I'd lived 50 years thinking he was dead, and now he was really dying. I said I'd come that week and asked him to send me the address. After the call, I sat in my chair for a long time, trying to process what had happened. My father had been alive all these years, living somewhere in Florida under a different name. But why? What could force a person to fake his own death and abandon a 7-year-old daughter? I called Emily, then Susan, trying to explain the incredible situation. Both women were shocked and insisted on coming with me, but I knew I had to face this meeting alone. I needed to hear the truth myself, no matter how painful it might be. Florida greeted me with humid heat and unfamiliar sense of blooming orange trees. I took a taxi from the airport to the address my father had given me, nervously fidgeting with a small photograph the whole way, the only one I'd brought with me. In it, I was 4 years old, sitting on my father's lap, and we were both laughing at something off camera. The house was small but well-maintained, with palm trees in the yard and blooming bougainvillea at the entrance. I stood at the door for several minutes trying to gather courage. My hands were shaking when I finally pressed the doorbell. The door was opened by an elderly man with a cane. He was significantly older and weaker than I'd expected, and clearly ill. His skin had a yellowish tint, and his movements were slow and careful. But his eyes were the same ones I remembered from childhood. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears, and he whispered my childhood name. I threw myself into his arms like a little girl and felt him stroke my hair, just as he had done many years ago. We both cried, standing in the doorway, ignoring the curious looks from neighbors. I felt years of pain and resentment, battling with joy that my father was alive. He led me into the simply furnished living room, where many photographs hung on the walls. I saw an unfamiliar middle-aged woman with a kind face, a young girl with dark hair, children. My father explained that this was his second family. Mary, his wife, had died 3 years ago. Patricia was their daughter, 41 years old. She had 2 children, Michael and Sarah. I felt a sharp stab of jealousy. I had a half-sister I didn't know about. A daughter who had grown up with my father while I thought he was dead. And she had children, my nephews and niece who knew their grandfather while I didn't. I sat on the couch, feeling like a stranger in my father's house, and asked what had happened, why Mom said he had died. My father heavily settled into the chair across from me and began telling a story that made my blood run cold. In 1975, my father worked construction on a new shopping center in Rutland. The work was hard but well paid, and he and Mom dreamed of buying their own house. After work, he often stopped by the Blue Moon Bar to have a beer with colleagues. This was common practice for workers of that time. On that fateful evening, there was a drunk customer in the bar who was harassing a young waitress. The girl was very young, maybe 18, and you could see she was frightened. My father couldn't just watch. He approached the man and asked him to leave the girl alone. But the man was very drunk and aggressive, started yelling that my father shouldn't interfere in his business, then swung at him. In the ensuing scuffle, the man fell, hit his head on the edge of a table, and died on the spot. Witnesses confirmed that my father had acted in self-defense, but he was arrested anyway. He told me this without raising his eyes, and I could see tears flowing down his cheeks. He hadn't wanted to kill anyone, just wanted to protect the girl. But the man died, and my father got 5 years for involuntary manslaughter. I sat in silence, trying to process the information. My father wasn't just alive, he was a killer. An accidental one, but still a killer. When he was arrested, Mom was 4 months pregnant. I was supposed to become a big sister, but from the stress, from all this nightmare, she lost the baby. The doctor said it was a boy. They wanted to name him Tommy. I closed my eyes, imagining the brother I never had. My father continued, explaining that when he was in prison, he and Mom corresponded. She brought me to visit him the first 2 years. I remembered this, the big gray building where we sat at a table, and Daddy looked very sad in orange clothes. Mom told me he was in the hospital. She didn't want me to know the truth, didn't want me to think my father was a criminal. But seeing me cry every time we had to part was unbearable. That's when they decided I should think he was dead. It was his decision. He made Mom agree. He said it would be better if I thought I had a good father who died than to know my father had killed someone. After his release, my father was a broken man. Prison had changed him. He started drinking, fell into deep depression. He couldn't sleep at night, remembering that man's face. My father told me how he tried to kill himself twice in the first year after his release. How they found him in a motel with slashed wrists. How he swallowed pills but was saved. He couldn't come back to me in that condition. He didn't want me to see him like that. Broken, drinking, full of self-hatred. By then, Mom was already dating Charlie Miller, a good man who later became my stepfather. He never tried to replace my father, but he was a good husband to Mom. My father saw that I was happy. Mom wrote to him that I was an honor student, that I had friends, that I dreamed of becoming a teacher. Charlie was a good man, and my father knew he would give me what he couldn't: stability, a normal family. But I missed my father every day. Every day I thought about him, prayed for him, dreamed that he was somewhere up in heaven, watching over me. And he was watching, not from heaven, but from Florida. He moved there in 1980, changed his name, started a new life. He met Mary at a clinic where he was being treated for alcoholism. She was a nurse, very patient and understanding. She helped him get back on his feet, find work, stop drinking. When Mary became pregnant, my father realized he had a chance to start over, to be a good father this time, not to destroy another family. I sat and listened, feeling different emotions battling inside me. I was his daughter, but he thought he'd forever lost the right to be my father. He believed it was better to leave me with good memories of him than to show me what he'd become. Mom knew he was alive until her death. They corresponded occasionally. She told him about me, about my achievements, about how I became a teacher, married Robert, had Susan, and then Emily appeared. He kept every school photo of me, every newspaper article about me that Mom cut out and sent. He knew I graduated college with honors, that I was the best teacher at school, that Robert was a good husband, that Susan got into medical school. He knew everything but couldn't be part of it. He knew everything about my life, but I didn't know he was alive. Every year on my birthday, he bought me a gift. Every Christmas. Mary thought it was for charity, but he stored them in a closet. They were still there, gifts from a father who couldn't give them. The next day, Patricia was supposed to come. My father warned that she hadn't taken the news of my existence very well, that she was afraid I would take away what she had. Her husband had recently filed for divorce. The children lived far away, and my father was all she had left. Patricia arrived in an expensive car wearing expensive sunglasses. I immediately saw something familiar in her. The stubborn chin she'd inherited from our father, the same eye color, the same habit of biting her lower lip when nervous. But the similarities ended there. Patricia was 16 years younger than me, well-dressed, with an expensive haircut and manicure. She looked like a woman who was used to getting what she wanted and was clearly unhappy with the current situation. She addressed me as that dead daughter, not even removing her sunglasses. My father sharply reprimanded her, but she wasn't about to back down. She asked if we should pretend this was normal, that some stranger just appears and claims rights to their family. I felt my blood boil. I'd flown across the country to meet the father I thought was dead, and this woman was treating me like an imposter. I explained that I wasn't claiming any rights, that I just wanted to understand what had happened to my father. Patricia laughed bitterly. She said he'd been her father for the last 40 years, that he'd changed her diapers, read her bedtime stories, taught her to ride a bike, walked her to school, attended her graduations, walked her down the aisle. She asked where I'd been all this time. When I explained that I thought he was dead, she snorted, that it was very convenient, and that I'd only appeared now that he was really dying. She asked where I'd been when she was caring for Mom, when they discovered Dad's cancer, when she needed an older sister. My father wearily intervened, explaining that I hadn't known about his existence, that he'd never told Patricia about his first family so as not to cause pain. He said I was her real sister. Patricia coldly corrected that I was her half-sister and that she hadn't asked for family, especially one that appears out of nowhere with claims. When I asked what claim she was talking about, explaining that I'd only learned of my father's existence a week ago, she came closer and asked why I was there then, why I hadn't left things as they were. I shouted that I had the right to know the truth, that I'd thought my father was dead for 50 years, that I wanted to talk to him before he really died. My father struggled to get up from his chair and demanded we stop. He said Patricia wasn't the enemy, that she was as much his daughter as I was, but that this was also a shock for her. I suggested staying in a hotel, not wanting to create problems in the family. Patricia agreed that was a good idea, but my father firmly said I should stay, that this was my home too. Patricia took her purse and headed for the door, saying she'd return tomorrow and hoped Dad would come to his senses by then. After she left, my father asked me to forgive her, explaining that she was just scared. Her husband had recently left her for a young secretary. The children lived in other states and rarely visited. He was all she had left. The next few days were tense. Patricia came every day to check on my father's condition, but barely spoke to me. We divided the caregiving duties, but did so silently, like strangers, forced to cooperate in difficult circumstances. James was visibly weakening. Chemotherapy wasn't helping, and doctors suggested stopping treatment. He needed constant care. Patricia wanted to hire a nurse, but I was surprised why, if we could take care of him ourselves. She looked at me with surprise, asking what I meant by we, since I'd be leaving in a few days. I realized I hadn't thought about leaving. The thought of leaving my father now was unbearable. I said I'd stay as long as necessary. She noted that I had my own life in Vermont, but I explained that my place was here now. She said she couldn't pay for my hotel stay, but I wasn't asking. I had my pension and could rent a small apartment. My father weakly said there was enough room for everyone, so I stayed in the house where my half-sister had grown up. The first few days were awkward. We barely spoke to each other, communicating only about Dad's needs. But illness doesn't wait. James began needing help with the simplest things. I helped him with medications in the morning, Patricia in the evening. We took turns cooking, cleaned the house, drove him to appointments. Gradually, the ice began to thaw. Patricia noticed that I cooked the same way her mom did. I asked what Mary was like, and she told me she was kind, worked at the hospital, always helped people. Dad adored her. I nodded, feeling the familiar stab of jealousy. Then Patricia asked about my mom. I told her she was strong, raised me alone, worked at a store to make ends meet. She remarried when I was 16, but always said no one could replace my real father. Patricia noted that she'd loved him, and I agreed until her death. We fell silent, thinking about two women who had loved the same man at different times. A week later, my father could no longer get out of bed. Patricia and I took turns on duty, but often found ourselves in his room at the same time. One night, I asked her to tell me about her childhood with him. Patricia hesitated at first, then began to tell me about how Dad taught her to ride a bike, how they went fishing, how he helped her with homework. I asked if he told her bedtime stories. She smiled and said yes, about talking animals and magical forests, especially about Benny the bear, who could bake pies. I smiled too. Benny had been my favorite character. Dad told me about him when I was 4. Patricia quietly noted that he'd remembered, and I agreed. We began sharing memories. It turned out that Dad had preserved many traditions from his first family. The songs he sang, the jokes he told, even the way he made pancakes. He'd passed all of this on to his second daughter, too. Patricia admitted she'd always felt he was hiding something. Sometimes he'd become very sad for no reason, especially on my birthday. Every year on March 15th, he'd be gloomy. Mary thought it was work-related. I felt my heart squeeze. He'd remembered. All these years, he'd remembered the birthday of the daughter he thought he'd never see again. Patricia said she now understood. He'd loved me, that she could see it. He'd loved us both, just differently. We continued talking, and I learned that Dad had never forgotten his first family. He told Patricia about a daughter who had died, but she thought he meant someone else. Now everything was falling into place. James was fading quickly. The doctor said it was a matter of days, maybe weeks. I called Susan and Emily, explained the situation. They wanted to fly down, but I asked them to wait. I needed to fix everything between all of us first. Patricia brought her children, Michael, 22, and Sarah, 20. They were confused to learn about their aunt's existence, but were warm toward me. Sarah asked if that meant I was their real aunt, and I confirmed, apologizing that we were meeting under such circumstances. Michael said that Grandpa had mentioned a daughter who died, and they thought he meant someone else. I realized that Dad had never forgotten me. Even while creating a new family, he'd kept the memory of his first daughter. One morning, Dad asked Patricia and me to sit by his bed. He needed to say something, and his voice was barely audible. I took one of his hands. Patricia took the other. He said he'd never stopped loving me, not for a single day. He thought he'd done the right thing, but now understood he'd been selfish. He'd deprived me of a father and himself of a daughter. When I asked him not to talk about it, he insisted he had to. He wanted me to know. Every birthday, he'd bought me a gift. Every Christmas. Mary thought it was for charity, but he'd stored them in a closet. They were still there. Patricia sobbed, and Dad turned to her, saying that my appearance didn't mean he'd loved her less. A father's heart is big enough for all his children. She replied that she knew that now. He asked us to take care of each other, saying we were sisters, that blood was the same. Patricia and I looked at each other over his bed. Both our eyes were full of tears. We promised we'd take care of each other. James died peacefully the following week. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Patricia was beside me, along with her children and Susan and Emily, who had come from Vermont. The funeral was modest. Friends and neighbors knew him as James Rivers, a kind neighbor and loving father. I didn't tell them the truth about his past. Some secrets are better kept. After the funeral, we returned to the house to sort through his belongings. Patricia showed me the closet Dad had mentioned. There really were boxes of gifts, one for each year. Dolls, books, jewelry, clothes. Gifts from a father who couldn't give them. I cried, holding a child's dress he'd bought for my 8th birthday, the year of his disappearance. A dress I'd never worn. Patricia said I should take everything, that it was mine, but I shook my head. I'd take just a few things. The rest could be donated. He would have wanted that. We spent the following days cleaning the house and handling practical matters. I helped Patricia with documents. She told me about Dad's habits I didn't know. Slowly, carefully, we began building a relationship. Patricia admitted she'd been afraid of me, afraid I'd take away her memories of Dad. But now she understood that there was enough memory for everyone. Moreover, now she had someone else who'd loved him too, who understood her loss. I told her about my childhood without a father, about how I'd searched for his features in other men, how I'd tried to fill the emptiness he'd left. She shared her fears. What would happen when Dad was gone? That she'd be alone with her problems. We realized we had each other, that we could be the family we'd both been missing. I invited her and the children to Vermont, and she invited me to stay in Florida longer. When it came time for my departure, I stood at Dad's grave with Patricia. A real grave, with a real body, with real flowers. I would no longer talk to an empty stone. I thought about forgiveness, how hard it is to forgive someone who caused such pain. But I understood that Dad had suffered no less than I had. He'd lived 50 years, thinking he'd done the right thing, but tormented by doubts. He'd loved me enough to let me go, even if it was wrong. Patricia took my hand. She said she was grateful I'd come, that I'd been able to say goodbye to Dad, that now she had the sister she'd always wanted. I squeezed her hand in return. We agreed to stay in touch, to call regularly, to visit each other. Michael and Sarah were already planning a trip to Vermont for the holidays. Susan and Emily invited Patricia to visit them. The family I'd lost at age 7 was finally reunited, though in a different form. Life after the truth. Several months have passed since I returned to Vermont. The house seemed both familiar and strange to me. I still tended my garden, read by the fireplace, knitted for the shelter. But now there were 2 photographs on the mantel, Robert's and Dad's. I often think about how my life changed because of a simple DNA test. Emily was right. It really became an adventure, though not the kind we expected. We learned who we really were. But the price of that knowledge was very high. I'm no longer angry at Dad. Time and understanding his motives helped me forgive. He did what he thought was best for me, even if it was a mistake. A mother's love makes us protect our children at any cost, and a father's love sometimes makes us let go. Patricia calls me every week. We discuss daily affairs, share memories of Dad, plan meetings. She tells me stories about his second life, and I tell her about how we lived thinking he was dead. Gradually, we're putting together the complete picture of the man we both loved. Michael and Sarah actually came for the holidays. It was strange to see Dad's features in them, gestures, facial expressions, manner of speaking, but it was a good kind of strange. They told me about the grandfather I didn't know, how he taught them to fish, how he told stories about Benny the bear to their children. Susan and Emily also accepted the new relatives. Emily was especially excited to learn she had cousins. She's already making plans for a big family reunion. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if we hadn't taken that test. Dad would have died without ever seeing me again. Patricia and I would never have met. Family secrets would have remained buried forever. But fate decided otherwise. Truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it causes pain, destroys illusions, forces you to reconsider your whole life. But it can also heal, unite, give a second chance. In my case, it gave me a father for a few months and a sister for the rest of my life. Today, a year later, I sit in my garden reading a letter from Patricia. She writes about how she's slowly recovering from her divorce, how the children are helping her cope with Dad's loss. She thanks me for teaching her not to fear the past, for showing her how to live with pain and still be happy. I smile, folding the letter. On the table next to me is a box of Dad's gifts, those very ones he'd bought for me all those years. I open them one by one each month, stretching out the reunion with him. Today it's the turn of a children's book he bought for my 10th birthday. On the first page, in his handwriting, "For my little Ellie, who will always be in my heart." Tears flow down my cheeks, but these aren't tears of grief. These are tears of gratitude for fate giving me a chance to learn the truth, to say goodbye to my father, and to find the family I hadn't had for 50 years. The phone rings. It's Emily, excitedly telling me about her new project. She wants to write a book about our family story. I laugh and tell her that some stories are worth telling, especially those that teach us to forgive, to love, and never to lose hope. When I hang up, the sun is already setting. Soon Patricia and the children will come for their promised visit. We'll cook together, share memories, plan the future. We're no longer strangers, connected only by shared grief. We're family, not perfect, with a complicated history, but ours. I think about how one simple test changed everything. How science helped us find each other after 50 years of separation. How love, even distorted by fear and pain, still finds a way to connect people. At my age, I thought all the important discoveries were behind me, that life had become predictable and calm. But it turned out that the most important lessons await us at the most unexpected moments. The lesson of forgiveness, the lesson of family, the lesson that it's never too late to start over. I get up to prepare the house for my guests' arrival. No, not guests. Family. My family, which I lost at 7 and found at 57. Better late than never.